On a damp Thursday morning, the kind that soaked through your coat before you even reached the curb, a young woman stood at the corner of Oak Ridge and Main. Her name was Grace Whitmore, though no one here knew that yet. She wore a pale beige coat that had once been new, though now the fabric clung to her with the weight of rain. Her hair, a cascade of soft golden curls, was pulled back loosely, damp strands framing her face. In her hands she held a galvanized bucket, heavy with white peonies, delicate blossoms wrapped in brown paper that had begun to crinkle from the drizzle. She didn't call out, didn't wave signs or push her flowers forward. She simply stood there, quiet and upright, as if the storm was something she had long ago accepted. People passed her without stopping, some barely acknowledging her at all. Behind the large front window of a bakery across the street, 3 older women watched from behind cups of steaming coffee. One of them, a former librarian named Susan, lowered her voice just enough to whisper, "She's too pretty to be standing there like that. I don't understand what's going on with girls these days." Another, Patricia, added, "She should be modeling, not selling wet flowers." The third woman, Elaine, didn't say anything at all. She simply watched. Grace looked young, 25, maybe 26, but not naive. There was something ancient in her stillness, as though she had been waiting on that corner not for minutes but for years. Her eyes scanned the street without urgency, the way one might scan the horizon when they already knew the ship would come. She didn't appear desperate or embarrassed or broken. There was a quiet sort of strength about her, the kind that unsettled people who couldn't understand how someone with so little could carry herself with so much calm. Every few minutes, a passerby glanced at her with mild curiosity, only to look away when met with her direct gaze. There was nothing confrontational in her expression, but there was a firmness, a refusal to be pitied, which made people uncomfortable. And so the day went on, the rain fell harder, and the girl with the flowers stood her ground, as if she belonged there more than any of them ever had. The rain had started to ease into a steady rhythm, the kind that painted the sidewalks in reflection and softened the sharpness of the morning. Grace remained where she was, her shoes soaked through, the hem of her coat heavy with water, yet she didn't shift or fidget. Her hands, pale and slender, held the bucket with the same composure as a performer holding an instrument between movements. The flowers, though damp, retained their elegance. White peonies with tightly wound centers, their edges beginning to fray just slightly under the weight of the weather, seemed to echo the quiet persistence of the girl who held them. Inside the bakery across the street, the women at the window had been joined by others. The morning rush had begun to thin, and now the cafe was occupied mostly by retirees and store clerks on break. The chatter, once idle and benign, began to focus more deliberately on the solitary figure outside. One man, seated near the door, glanced at her, then turned to the barista. "Is she always there?" he asked. The young woman shrugged. "She's been coming for 3 days now. Same spot. Doesn't say much." At another table, a man in his 30s wearing a sharp gray suit shook his head and muttered to his companion, "What's her angle? These street performers always have one." His tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive in the way that comfortable people often are when confronted by something they don't understand. The companion laughed and leaned in closer. "Maybe she's doing a social experiment. You know, like that YouTube thing? Rich girl pretends to be homeless to see who helps her." Their laughter wasn't loud, but it carried. It wasn't long before others began to speculate. A young mother tugging a toddler behind her in a plastic raincoat slowed her pace and gave Grace a second look. Her child stared openly at the flowers, entranced, but the mother gave a polite, tight smile and moved on. A delivery driver stopped briefly in his van, looked at Grace, then muttered something under his breath before pulling into the alley behind the cafe. The glances grew more frequent, the pauses longer. Grace remained unmoved, acknowledging no one unless directly approached. Her presence, silent but persistent, began to irritate in ways no one could quite articulate. She wasn't begging, she wasn't asking for anything, she simply was. A group of young professionals exited the bank building across the street. 3 men in navy and charcoal suits, laughing about something one of them said in the elevator, stepped into the rain under a single oversized umbrella. One of them, seeing Grace, grinned. "There she is," he said, elbowing the man next to him. "Still there, she's like a statue." The second man chuckled. "A statue with bad timing. Who sells flowers in the rain?" The third, tall and smug in a tie that cost more than the rent of most apartments, tilted his head and said loudly enough to carry across the street, "Maybe she's waiting for her prince to arrive. On a white horse, or maybe a helicopter." They laughed together, unbothered by the sharpness of their own mockery. The umbrella drifted down the street with them, leaving Grace in the silence that followed. Grace, for her part, did not flinch. She didn't smile or look away or react at all. Her hand stayed steady on the handle of the bucket, her eyes focused not on the crowd or the windows, but somewhere else. Something distant and internal. A woman in her 60s exiting the bakery with a bag of warm rolls paused beside Grace and hesitated. She reached into her purse and held out a crumpled $5 bill. "Here, honey, get yourself a coffee," she said softly, as if trying not to embarrass her. Grace looked at the woman, met her eyes with kindness, and answered gently, "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm not collecting money. I'm just selling flowers." The woman, taken aback, flushed and stammered something about not meaning anything by it, then walked away quickly. The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Back inside the bakery, Susan watched the entire thing with a strange expression. Part guilt, part defensiveness. "Well," she said, picking up her cup again, "at least she's polite. But honestly, what does she expect? People don't buy flowers in this weather. She'd do better at the farmer's market." Her words were met with nods, but they felt less certain now. Elaine remained quiet. She watched Grace with a furrowed brow and fingers clasped tightly in her lap, as if something in the girl's posture triggered a memory she couldn't quite place. Meanwhile, the drizzle thickened again into full rain, the kind that made people retreat under awnings and hurry across intersections. A pair of teenagers walking home from school passed Grace, their backpacks soaked through, and one of them whispered something into the other's ear. The second girl giggled and snapped a quick photo before they moved on, not waiting to see if Grace noticed. She didn't. She had turned slightly, adjusting the bucket in her arms, eyes drifting to the church steeple visible a few blocks away. Something about the way she tilted her head in that moment made her look not fragile but devout. The corner on which she stood had become, in a matter of hours, something more than just an intersection. It was now a stage, a question mark, a mirror. No one could say exactly why, but people found themselves returning to that window, to that table, to that street, watching the girl who asked for nothing and yet unsettled everything. And somewhere beneath the noise of conversation and the tapping of raindrops on glass, something was beginning to shift. The day hadn't changed, but the mood had. People were watching now, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort, and they didn't know why. As the afternoon crept forward, the air grew colder and the light dimmer. The storm clouds overhead had thickened into an unbroken slate of gray, and the rain, though steady, took on a sharper chill that made people walk faster, clutch their coats tighter, and avoid eye contact with anything that slowed them down. Grace still stood in the same place, her posture unchanged. Her pale fingers were red now from the cold, and her shoes had long since surrendered to the water that pooled in shallow puddles along the sidewalk. Yet she gave no sign of discomfort or doubt. She simply stood there, silent and calm, the bucket of white peonies still resting in her arms like something sacred, untouched by the indifference of the city around her. The bakery's front window had fogged up from the warmth inside, but it didn't stop the watchers from peering through. By now, nearly everyone inside knew about the girl across the street. She had become the unofficial subject of the day's gossip. Each customer who entered was offered the same quiet spectacle with their coffee. The girl in the rain, still there, unmoving, unyielding. Some commented with concern, others with irritation. It wasn't that she had done anything wrong. She hadn't spoken loudly or begged or caused a scene. But her stillness was beginning to feel like a disruption, a break in the rhythm of a town that didn't like questions it couldn't answer. Then came the man in the beige overcoat. His umbrella was large and expensive, his shoes polished despite the weather, and the scarf he wore bore the discreet emblem of a luxury brand. He was in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with that upright bearing that suggested he believed things should be a certain way and that it was his job to enforce them. He approached Grace with a purposeful stride, his expression already tight with disapproval. From the bakery window, several heads turned to watch, the quiet inside thickening as if someone had turned down the volume. "Excuse me," the man said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rain. "You can't stay here." Grace turned to him slowly, her eyes calm, her lips neutral. "I'm not blocking the sidewalk," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "It's not about blocking," he snapped, adjusting his scarf. "This is a commercial district. This corner is part of the historic preservation zone. There are rules about street vendors." "I'm not a vendor," Grace said, still calm. "I'm not shouting or advertising. I'm simply standing." "With a bucket of flowers and a price tag?" he asked, pointing with a gloved hand at the small cardboard sign resting against the side of the bucket. "That qualifies as solicitation." She looked at the sign, then back at him. "I didn't write a price. It just says flowers for anyone who wants them." Her tone hadn't changed, but there was a slight narrowing of her eyes, not aggressive but discerning. "I'm calling the city inspector," the man said, already reaching for his phone. "You can't just stand wherever you like and pretend you're not conducting business. This isn't a park bench. We don't need loitering." She said nothing in reply. Instead, she shifted the bucket slightly, aligning it neatly with the edge of the curb, as if to show him her full awareness of boundaries, physical and otherwise. It was not defiance. It was a kind of exacting grace, the same kind found in someone who lays a table perfectly even when dining alone. The man, frustrated by her lack of visible reaction, turned and walked briskly back the way he came, shaking his head. His umbrella left a trail of water as he disappeared into the boutique across the street. A few moments later, a teenager rode past on a bike, splashing through the edge of a puddle that soaked Grace's legs even further. He didn't look back. A couple in their 70s walked by arm in arm, the woman glancing at Grace and murmuring something to her husband, who nodded solemnly but didn't stop. A young girl holding her father's hand slowed down, tugging at his coat to look at the flowers, but he guided her away with a quick shake of his head. More eyes now avoided Grace than met hers. It wasn't cruelty, it was something quieter, more insidious. The discomfort of being faced with someone who couldn't be categorized or dismissed. Inside the bakery, the murmuring had shifted. "She could go to a shelter if she's cold," someone said near the back. "There's no need to stand there like that. It's theatrical." The comment wasn't meant to be harsh, but it revealed the new undercurrent taking shape. A sense that Grace's very presence was becoming inconvenient. Not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. She didn't fit the script people wanted to believe about suffering. She didn't plead or look broken. She didn't seek approval or play the part of the humble poor girl. She simply existed, and for many that was harder to digest than any cry for help. Then, as if to punctuate the shift, a delivery van pulled into the curb beside her. The driver rolled down the window, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a headset still dangling from one ear. "Hey," he called. "You selling those?" Grace turned to him and nodded gently. "If you want one, take one." He looked at her for a moment, then reached for his wallet. "How much?" "There's no price," she said. "Whatever you think it's worth." He handed her a crumpled 10 and picked out a flower with fingers that were surprisingly careful for someone who probably carried boxes all day. "It's for my daughter," he muttered. "She's having a rough week." Grace offered a smile that was brief, almost invisible. "Tell her it's a strong flower, it holds up in the rain." The driver gave a nod that was almost reverent and drove off without another word. The exchange was quiet, but in the bakery those who saw it felt something settle into their chests. Not guilt, not clarity, but discomfort, because it was easier when she was invisible, and now she wasn't. As the wind picked up again and another curtain of rain swept across the square, Grace remained. She adjusted the bucket in her hands and looked up at the sky, her eyes squinting not from sadness or pain, but from habit, like someone used to watching storms roll in without flinching. The flowers trembled in the wind, but she didn't. And inside warm shops and offices and homes, people continued to pretend not to see her, even as they couldn't stop watching. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the day had shifted into something slower, more thoughtful. The early bustle had faded, the lunchtime rush was over, and only the occasional pedestrian passed through the gray sheen of the wet street. The rain had quieted to a misty drizzle, the kind that clung to everything like memory, and the town had taken on that strange stillness that arrives before night but after motion. Grace was still there. She hadn't left the corner, hadn't sought shelter or sympathy. Her coat was now thoroughly soaked, the fabric clinging to her arms and shoulders, darkened by water but clean, as if even the rain respected her composure. Her boots, more worn than stylish, were speckled with mud, and the flowers, what remained of them, looked freshly cut despite the hours exposed to the elements. Their white petals had not browned, and their leaves remained crisp, as though her hands alone preserved their dignity. It was around this time that an elderly man emerged from the antique bookstore 2 blocks down. He wore a wool cap and used a cane, his steps slow but steady, the kind of man who had made peace with time and gravity. As he neared Grace, he paused, not because he recognized her, not because he was curious, but because he was tired, and that part of the sidewalk had a wide enough ledge for him to rest. He sat without a word, glancing at her only once, then looking straight ahead at the street. The two of them remained in silence for a while, strangers sharing a moment unspoken. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat and said in a voice as worn as his jacket, "I used to bring my wife peonies every year on our anniversary. She said they looked like clouds trying to hold secrets." Grace smiled, not broadly, but with the kind of quiet that warms gently rather than bursts. She said nothing, only reached into her bucket and handed him a single stem. He didn't protest, didn't offer money. He took the flower in his trembling hand and looked at it as if it were the first peony he had ever seen. "You grow these?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Then you understand," he murmured. She nodded again and he stood slowly, tipping an invisible hat in her direction before continuing on, the cane tapping in rhythm with his thoughts. That exchange changed something. Not in the air, not in the clouds overhead or the puddles at her feet, but in the tone of the watching. People still looked, still whispered, but there was a shift. Elaine, the quietest of the 3 women in the bakery, turned to the others and said softly, "Do you remember when that little flower shop was on 3rd Street? The one run by that girl and her grandmother?" The others paused. "Vaguely," Susan replied. "Why?" Elaine didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on Grace. Something had started to surface, a thread of recollection not yet fully formed. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in a navy trench coat approached. She was dressed impeccably, her heels somehow navigating the wet pavement with practiced ease. She stopped in front of Grace, her expression unreadable. "Do you know who owns that lot behind you?" she asked, gesturing toward the old storefront, long boarded up. Grace looked over her shoulder briefly, then back. "No," she said simply. "Why?" The woman hesitated. "I used to run a flower shop there, years ago. My mother passed it on to me. We sold peonies like those." There was no trace of warmth in her voice, only the faint tightness that grief leaves behind when it lingers too long. Grace said nothing, only extended the bucket forward. The woman took a flower without asking and studied it, her fingers brushing its petals with unconscious tenderness. Then, as if caught in the act of remembering, she turned and left without another word, the peony clutched like an apology. The bakery crowd had thinned, but the remaining few leaned forward unconsciously, as though watching the edges of something begin to fray. People who had laughed or shrugged earlier now stared with a silence they didn't recognize in themselves. No one had demanded anything of them. Grace hadn't once spoken of hardship or loss or the weather, but something in her steadiness had become undeniable. And yet, despite this subtle transformation in mood, no one dared cross the street. Not because of fear, but because something about her presence demanded sincerity, and most people weren't ready to offer it. Across the street, a pair of children came skipping along the curb, their raincoats brightly colored, their boots stomping in puddles without care. One of them, a girl with curly brown hair, stopped suddenly and pointed at the bucket. "Daddy, look! That's the flower from the book!" The father, a young man holding a paper bag of groceries, looked down. "What book?" She bounced on her heels. "The one with the garden that makes people kind again." He gave her a puzzled smile and was about to guide her forward when she pulled away gently and approached Grace. She didn't speak. She only reached out, small fingers brushing against the cold edge of the bucket. Grace looked at her and smiled, not as an adult condescending to a child, but as if greeting an equal. Without speaking, she offered the child a peony. The girl took it reverently, like something breakable, and ran back to her father, who stared at the exchange with sudden softness in his expression. It was the kind of moment that didn't make a sound, but somehow echoed anyway. Grace turned back to the street, her eyes again lifted to that same fixed point in the distance. Something in her posture said she was not merely watching the world, but waiting for it to remember something it had forgotten. No one yet knew what, but there was no denying it anymore. She wasn't just there. She was present. She was deliberate. And whatever she was waiting for, it wasn't charity, it wasn't rescue, and it wasn't permission. As dusk began to descend over the town, the quality of the light changed in that quiet, imperceptible way it always did, when the sun disappeared behind the thick, wet sky before it ever reached the horizon. Street lamps flickered on in a slow ripple down Main Street, casting long reflections across the slick pavement, and shopkeepers began turning their signs to "closed," the end of the day settling in with the same rhythm as the mist that had returned, to hang between the buildings. Grace was still there. By now, she had become less a person and more a part of the street itself, like the bench she stood near or the lamppost behind her. People had adjusted to her the way one adjusts to a new statue in a public park. Curious at first, then increasingly unsure what to think as time wears on and meaning doesn't reveal itself easily. Inside the bakery, the crowd had thinned to only a handful of regulars. Elaine had remained seated at her usual corner table, watching Grace with the same attention she might have once reserved for a film. Her eyes narrowed in a way that suggested not judgment but memory. Across from her, Susan scrolled her phone with a distracted finger, while Patricia chatted with the barista about an upcoming charity auction. None of them had acknowledged directly what had changed in the air, but all of them felt it. There was a tension now, a pressure behind the glass. Something was building and no one could explain what or why. Then came the sound that would fracture the moment into before and after. The sudden and unmistakable whirring of rotors, distant but approaching fast. At first it blended with the ambient noise of the town, the cars and the hum of rain against pavement, but it grew steadily louder until it could no longer be mistaken for anything else. People inside the bakery looked up. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Outside heads turned upward instinctively. The sound echoed down the street like a slow, rising drumbeat, and within moments a black helicopter emerged from behind the eastern row of buildings, its lights cutting through the mist in white beams that looked like searchlights. The sight alone was enough to draw people out of shops and onto sidewalks. By now, even those who had previously pretended not to see Grace were looking directly at her. Their faces transformed from mild curiosity to outright confusion. The helicopter hovered briefly above the town square, circling once in a wide, deliberate arc before beginning its descent. There was no designated landing space, no rooftop pad or cordoned-off zone. It touched down on the empty lot adjacent to the boarded-up storefront behind Grace, the vacant gravel lot that had long been forgotten by most of the neighborhood. As the rotors slowed, kicking up leaves and dust and bits of litter, the crowd began to gather in clusters, murmuring among themselves. Phones appeared in hands, not for spectacle or mockery this time, but in stunned silence as though unsure whether this was something private or historic or both. Grace didn't move, not even when the gust from the descending blades whipped her coat around her legs and sent the petals of her last few peonies scattering onto the street like confetti at the end of a forgotten parade. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the open hatch of the helicopter, where a tall figure appeared in a dark coat, stepping down with the calm assurance of someone long accustomed to entering rooms just after the atmosphere had changed. He was in his early 60s, silver hair combed neatly back, his expression unreadable. The man crossed the lot toward Grace slowly, not as if he were searching for her, but as if he already knew exactly where she'd be. The crowd didn't dare speak, but they didn't disperse either. Something about the way the man walked, deliberate but unhurried, suggested that this was not a disruption, not a coincidence, but a continuation of something that had been in motion long before any of them had noticed. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance and looked at the bucket still cradled in her arms. Only one flower remained. Grace met his eyes without surprise. The exchange between them was wordless but full of weight, a language spoken through time rather than voice. At last, the man spoke, quietly but clearly enough for the few closest to hear. "Is the observation complete?" Grace nodded once. Her voice when it came was gentle but firm. "They've shown enough." "Enough for what?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Enough to decide if the garden still deserves to be planted here," she answered, her fingers curling around the handle of the now empty bucket. There was a pause. He looked past her at the faces now watching from across the street. Bakers, baristas, retirees, professionals, all of them uncertain now, not of her but of themselves. The man seemed to consider something, then extended his hand. Not an invitation, not in command, but as if to offer return. Grace took it without hesitation, and together they walked toward the helicopter. The moment they turned, the onlookers finally understood that something had shifted beyond recovery. The girl they thought they had identified, explained, dismissed. She was stepping into a vehicle none of them had been invited to imagine. And yet, no one moved to stop her, because the truth, though unspoken, had already begun to crystallize in their minds. She hadn't been standing there for their attention or approval. She had been waiting for the time to pass. She had been holding space in a world that no longer made space for stillness, and now the stillness was over. As the helicopter lifted again, petals still danced in the air, caught in the backwash of the rotors. One by one, they landed on the street, on shoulders, on the bakery awning, where they clung like little white flags of surrender. Inside the cafe, Elaine stood slowly. She pressed one hand to the fog glass and whispered, as if to no one, "I remember her now." No one asked what she meant. The question wasn't necessary. Whatever had just happened was no longer about understanding. It was about the silence left behind. The helicopter rose slowly with the heavy certainty of something that did not need to prove its power. Its rotors sliced the mist in even, patient circles, and the stormy sky above seemed to part slightly as if giving way, not in fear, but in quiet acknowledgement. On the ground below, the townspeople remained frozen, not by force or spectacle, but by the weight of what they had just witnessed. No one spoke. No one moved. The girl with the flowers, who for an entire day had stood silently under the indifferent drizzle of the world, was gone, lifted away not like a rescued soul, but like a returning monarch whose mission had been fulfilled. And though no words had named her, everyone watching understood they had failed a test they hadn't even known was being given. Inside the bakery, the silence that followed the ascent was so total, it pressed against the walls. Even the coffee machine hissed more quietly. Susan was the first to exhale, though she did so without realizing it, and the sound seemed almost vulgar in the hush. Patricia, still clutching her phone, lowered it slowly, her thumb hovering over the photo she'd taken minutes earlier. A blurry image of Grace standing with the older man beneath the beating blades. The picture now felt intrusive, almost shameful. She deleted it without speaking. Elaine remained standing near the window, her eyes fixed on the last wisps of vapor left in the helicopter's wake. She wasn't blinking. In her mind, she wasn't even here. She was years in the past, in a flower shop filled with morning light, the scent of soil and bloom, and a little girl, barefoot, laughing, dirt on her cheeks, handing her a mangled tulip and calling it perfect. The memory came with such force that it left her breathless. That little girl had been Grace. Outside on the sidewalk, the petals that had escaped during the helicopter's takeoff were now scattered like tiny flags of surrender. They clung to coats, floated in puddles, and rested on sidewalks. A few people instinctively bent to pick them up, but stopped themselves, as if realizing they had no right to hold onto them now. The peonies were no longer just flowers. They were something else. An imprint, a reminder, a quiet reprimand. From the far end of the street, a car pulled to a stop, and an elderly woman stepped out with careful deliberation, her coat buttoned to the throat and a cane gripped tightly in her hand. She had heard the sound from her apartment several blocks away, and had walked slowly, determinedly, without knowing why. She approached the bakery window, saw the faces inside, then turned to the empty space where Grace had stood. She bent, picked up one of the fallen petals, and pressed it gently into her palm, like a pressed flower in a family Bible. No one dared interrupt her. Further down the block, the man who had threatened to call the city inspector earlier now stood half-concealed in the doorway of a tailor shop. He didn't look proud. In fact, he looked lost. His hand was still in his pocket where the business card Grace had given him remained. He hadn't even looked at it properly before. Too annoyed, too certain of his assumptions. But now he pulled it out slowly and studied it. The embossed lettering, the weight of the paper, the quiet authority of the name on the card struck him like a whisper he didn't want to hear. He folded it back into his pocket with a gentleness he hadn't shown anyone that day. The world did not stop moving. Traffic resumed. Lights turned red and green again. The wind carried the last threads of noise away. But something in the town had shifted. Not publicly, not in any official capacity. There would be no news story, no television broadcast, but privately, deeply, in the kind of way that reshapes a place from the inside out. Everyone who had seen her now carried her absence like a presence. Not because she had exposed them, not even because she had left in such unignorable fashion, but because she had done it all without asking them to notice her. The finality of it settled in slowly. She wasn't coming back. Not to this corner, not with her bucket, not with her flowers. She had finished what she came to do, and she had done it so gently that no one could name the moment it changed them. That was her power. Not the helicopter, not the man in the coat, not the elegance of her silence, but the fact that she had offered herself like a mirror, and no one had liked what they saw reflected. As the bakery lights flickered and the last of the customers quietly made their way out into the deepening dark, the petals remained. Just petals, just rain, just memory now, and the knowledge that beauty had once stood in front of them, perfectly still, and waited to see who would offer kindness without needing a reason. Night fell without ceremony. The rain had stopped entirely by then, and in its place came that rare coastal stillness that seemed to press down from the sky and rise up from the wet pavement, wrapping the town in something more than silence, something closer to reckoning. Streetlights buzzed quietly. Neon signs blinked without urgency. And yet the corner where she had stood, so unremarkable the day before, now felt like a place no one wanted to pass too quickly. People walked around it without realizing. Some crossed to the other side of the street. Others slowed down as they neared it, drawn by the faint memory of her presence and unsure whether to feel guilt, awe, or something harder to name. The bucket was gone. The bench she'd leaned beside was empty, but petals still clung to the cracks in the sidewalk, and the scent of peonies, faint but persistent, lingered in the damp air like a perfume someone once wore just before leaving for good. In the bakery, Elaine was the last to leave. She paused at the window again, one hand on the sill, the other clutching a napkin folded carefully around a petal she had picked up from the sidewalk after the others left. She didn't say goodbye to the barista, didn't look back as the bell above the door chimed behind her. She walked down the street slowly, letting the sound of her own footsteps remind her that some things needed to be carried in silence. That girl, Grace, had been someone they thought they could sum up in a glance. And now she had become someone they would never fully understand. There had been no dramatic reveal, no proclamation, no confrontation. Just stillness, just observation, just one long day that held up a mirror, and then took it away before they were ready to look again. At home, people sat with their own discomfort. Some couldn't sleep. Others told themselves they were imagining it, that there was nothing particularly special about her, that they were assigning meaning where there was none. But the truth settled in quiet ways. In the hesitation before judging a stranger, in the sudden urge to offer something small without expecting thanks, in the way one might now notice who holds the door, who smiles, who stands silently in the rain, without asking to be rescued. That was her gift, though few would have called it that when she was standing among them. She had given them the chance to see who they were when no one was watching, and now, without intending to, they would carry that question with them everywhere. Far above the city, in a cabin quiet and dark, Grace looked out the window of the helicopter. Her hair was nearly dry now, her coat folded neatly on her lap. She watched the lights below without smiling. She didn't need to. Her expression was one of quiet understanding. Not victory, not satisfaction, just knowledge. The kind of knowledge you gather only by being still long enough for others to reveal themselves. The man beside her, silent since they took off, finally asked, not unkindly, "Was it worth the rain?" Grace didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the town below. "It always is," she answered.